Hello.
And you're live, Duncan.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our grab and go for Denmark in 2021. Last year I was there in person, and I'm obviously sorry not to be in Copenhagen again this year. I miss Copenhagen, Denmark, the Nordics, travel. As a matter of fact, being anywhere other than my own kitchen, which you currently see behind me. But on behalf of Frederick Bank and the entire team, welcome yet again to another grab and go. We have some exciting predictions for you for 2021. I think most of you may perhaps know who I am. For those of you who don't, I'm Duncan Stewart. I'm the Director of Research for Deloitte Canada. I'm a member of our US TMT Center for Research, but I also have a global role, and that global role is not only the privilege of writing some of the predictions each year. I wrote 3 of the 9 this year, but also being able to come around or virtually or in person and share the predictions. I think this is the 8th or 9th year I will have done a predictions launch in Copenhagen. So let's get started. Lena, next slide, please. I want to start off with the topic of video visits, obviously catalyzed, accelerated by the pandemic. Next slide, please. What we are seeing is video visits are exploding. That's the only possible word. Video visits, we believe, are going to be up about 50 times in 2021 compared to where we were in 2019. And even that 0.1% in 2019 may have even been an overestimate. Why does this matter so much? The market is completely enormous. Denmark, of course, relatively small country, 22 million visits, worth about a couple $2 billion. That's just Denmark. Globally, $8.5 billion doctor visits across the OECD, worth $500 billion. Once you include the rest of the world, the numbers here are on the order of well over 10 billion visits, worth well over $700 billion. So just massive, massive market. 5% of that translates into 400 million video visits and about $25 billion in value worldwide. Smaller numbers in Denmark, of course, but now it's not just about the doctor visits, right? There's lots of other stuff going on here. There are pure play companies in this space. We believe those companies are worth about $8 billion. Perhaps the best known are 2 that recently merged in the United States, Livongo and Teladoc. The other thing is that it's great to have a video camera on your laptop or smartphone or tablet, and you can have a visit with a doctor that way. And there's even a lot of stuff you can do. You can have a conversation and they can talk to you, and you can show them, like, if you've got a rash or something like that. But he or she can't take my blood pressure, my blood oxygen, my blood sugar, atrial fibrillation, dozens of indicators. For that, you need FDA-approved medical equipment. And we believe the market for the home healthcare technology for monitoring and diagnostics that essentially supercharges video visits, we believe that's a $33 billion a year industry, and that's going to be growing. Next slide, please, Lena. Fairly obviously, from the pandemic, we have a number of fascinating data points. I'm going to go through these quickly because it's really the next chart that's the most important. But let's stay on this one for a second. In the US, Medicare primary care visits up. You can see here 43.5 versus 0.1. That's up 435 times. That's big growth. Number of people on the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs up 12 times. In France, the number rose by 100 times. In Canada, and this speaks to the potential resilience of video visits going forward. In Canada, 1 in 7 Canadians said they would actually choose a video visit going forward where possible. And I want to caution you here because I think that number may actually be low, and I'll explain why in a second. Next slide, please, Lena. Now, I know this is hard to read. My apologies. Squint. Put on your glasses. Ooh, that's better. So this is an academic paper, peer-reviewed, published in JMIR Public Health and Surveillance, and it is the data from the Wexner Institute in Columbus, Ohio. That's at Ohio State. It is one of the top medical institutions in the United States. It's kind of like the Mayo Clinic, but in Ohio instead of in Minnesota. Okay, so really, really well regarded. And I want you to look at that first line there. They had 2,800 visits, of which 99.9% were in person as of March 1st, 2020. Feels about right. 4 weeks later, the number of in-person visits had dropped, and now telehealth represented 92%, of which the vast majority were phone calls. And just 4 weeks in, about 71% were by phone, and only about 21% were over video calls. As we move the tape forward, though, I want you to look at that number for April 26th. Number of visits, 2,100, 92% still done over telehealth, very few in person. However, it's flipped. What had been 71% video, 71% phone call, 21% video is now gone 70% video, 22. You see how people, at least in Ohio, doctors, at least in Ohio, preferred having video calls over phone calls when you couldn't have an in-person call. Now, this is obviously a single study. This was not the case everywhere. In, for example, the UK, the NHS data shows that phone calls were much more of a factor than video for various reasons. The UK seems to be much more about phone calls than video. But next slide, please. Now, you can see here's another U.S. institution. This is Duke in North Carolina. Tremendous growth in telehealth in general, but probably there it's more about 70% telephone and 25%, 30% video. So kind of closer to the UK data. But I think that the Wexner data is really interesting because it suggests the potential there. Next slide, please. What does this all mean? Let's kind of boil this one down. First of all, telehealth, telemedicine, enormous growth. It's going to probably drop a little, or is it? Deloitte US has a study. I've seen the study. It's not out yet. It'll be released February 18th. And in that study, what they did is they asked 50 of the largest hospitals and clinics and medical institutions in the United States two very clever questions. First is, during the pandemic, at peak, what was your maximum level of telehealth? Okay. And then they said, going forward, even with no pandemic, even after the vaccines, what do you think is the right number, the best number, the appropriate number for telehealth? And that number, well, I don't want to spoil it. The first question, what was the maximum number, turned out to be 33, 34% in the study. However, when asked what was the right number, the same people said about 33, 34%. They are essentially saying they think that the levels seen during the pandemic are not going to drop significantly because it turns out that video visits are actually a pretty good way of conducting health. Let me explain why. Some of you may be familiar with the medical term from French, triage. Triage refers to the idea that if I am a doctor walking into an emergency room of a hospital, there are a bunch of people in that emergency room. Some of them have, a stubbed finger or thumb or something like that. Somebody else has a knife sticking out of their chest. Triage is, I am going to treat the person with the most severe and important injury first, and I'm going to let the other people wait. It's the prioritization of scarce medical resources. In the same way, I believe that telehealth video visits are a form of triage. There's all kinds of stuff. If there's certain things I have, I'm going to go straight to the doctor. But there's other stuff where why don't we start with a video visit? Sorry, my phone should not be ringing right now. I just hung that up. There we go. Why not start with a video visit and talk to my doctor? And the doctor can then say, oh, let's solve your problem here and now. Or they can say, I think you need to come into my office. Or they can say, I think you need to go see a specialist. Or they can say, go to a hospital right now, you're having a heart attack, or whatever. But you get the idea. Video visits aren't perfect for everything, but they are a useful screening tool to perhaps begin the medical journey before you move on to more time-consuming and expensive solutions. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the radio access network. Next slide, please, Lena. So when you look at, so I'm going to look out my window right here, and you can't see it because I'm pointing at it, but I'm here in downtown Toronto, and just over my shoulder, about 100 meters away, is a radio tower from my friendly network operator who I happen to have a subscription with, okay? And at the top of that radio tower are a thing called the radio unit. That's a bunch of radios and antennas. And at the bottom is something called a baseband or base station unit, okay? Those are the two parts. Next slide, please. Now, I want to tell you a story here about my new phone. Here's Duncan's new phone. Very nice new phone, shiny. It's a 5G phone. It works on the 5G network. And I'm going to come back to this and talk about this in a second. But I just want to make it clear that here's my phone, and it's talking to that radio network over a RAN, a radio access network. As you can see, I don't even know what I'm going to do with 300 megabits per second, but anyway, there you go. Okay, so I got a 5G phone. It works on 5G because the speed, you couldn't get that speed on 4G. I have a 5G phone, and that's the RAN. Next slide, please. Now, when on this network, my local carrier, doesn't matter to you in Denmark, but it happens to be a company called Rogers, and they built that 5G network using gear from a company that you probably know quite well called Ericsson. Ericsson sold them a bunch of radios and a bunch of baseband units and a bunch of antennas and a bunch of software, and they installed it all across Canada, thousands, tens of thousands of stations. If to next year somebody else comes up with a really great antenna that's not from Ericsson, they can't put it in. If somebody comes up with a better base station, you can't put it in. If somebody who isn't Ericsson comes up with a better piece of software, you can't put it. The traditional RAN is a closed ecosystem, and you can't mix and match and upgrade and swap parts. It is a closed lockdown thing, and when you buy from Ericsson or Nokia or ZTE or Huawei or Samsung, it doesn't matter, you are locked into that. That's a traditional closed system. An open RAN, this is tricky, is an open system. It is just like an open data center or open software or open local area network. There's lots and lots of examples out there where we've seen things go from closed systems to open systems. Why move to open? Few reasons. It's generally believed that open systems over time tend to be promote more competition, more innovation, more agility, all that good kind of stuff. It lets new players into the game, new suppliers. It diversifies that market. Maybe they have new approaches. It also tends to be cheaper, savings on both CapEx and OpEx. But of course, all of that largely tends to be true for greenfield building new networks. Nobody in their right mind would tear out the existing closed RAN network and approach it, and replace it with open RAN. That just doesn't make any economic sense. Unless your government told you you had to. Around the world, we have seen, and I can predict we will continue to see, governments say, thou shalt remove all of the gear from that company, from your network, and you have to replace it with something else. If you think about it, every time that happens, that's basically a greenfield network. Equally, when companies that have not yet launched 5G think about launching 5G, each time that could be another kind of greenfield network. So the reason this prediction matters so much now is that both due to geopolitical reasons, largely around Chinese suppliers, and the move to 5G, we see basically a lot of chances for people to play around with Open RAN. Next slide. Now, what do we have around the world? We're predicting the number of Open RAN trials will double, in fact, this year compared to last year. Where is this happening? Now, you can see this chart as well as I can. There's stuff going on in North and South America and Europe, and that's great. And Rakuten in Japan, I'm going to come back to them in a sec. Hang on. But what I want to draw your attention to is what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa there, and also what's going on in specifically South Asia and India. So I was just on a webinar with India. We were talking a fair bit about the potential growth in Open RAN. Why does this matter so much? Back in 2000, there was a company called Huawei, now the world's largest manufacturer of mobile radio networks. Back in 2000, Huawei gear was new, and people just didn't know much about it. It did okay in China for sure, but it didn't sell in North America. It didn't sell in South America. It didn't really sell in Europe very much. Where, in fact, it got its first start was in Africa and South Asia. So keep an eye on that. That might be an interesting way of looking at the growth in Open RAN. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about Rakuten. Japanese company, new entrant. They're there in 4G. They're there in 5G. Subscriber growth's a little weaker than expected, but the network is apparently up and running and doing fairly well. They are reporting 30 to 40% OPEX and CAPEX savings. It's scaling fine. This is really going to be an interesting thing to watch. How well Rakuten does may, in fact, end up being a bit of a test case for the entire concept of Open RAN. So, stepping back. Open RAN, interesting, new, still small, even in 2021, tiny part of the market. But by 2025, by 2030, it would not surprise me if more than half of all the RANs, radio access networks in the world, were now open. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the cloud. Next slide, please, Lee. 2020. The numbers are still coming in, but it looks like the global economy dropped about 4.55% for 2020, which is, just for context, the worst ever economic contraction in history. Ever. As a result, a number of companies spent much less on IT. When you look at non-cloud IT spending, it looks like it dropped about 10% for the year, which once again is about the worst annual contraction in IT spending, non-cloud IT spending in history. I want you to hold that context because when people look at the cloud growth of 31%, 25%, 27%, the numbers for Q4 are coming in and they look to be in line. When people look at that number, they go, that's good. But, they grew 30% in 2019. Yeah. The really important part isn't that they grew 30%. It's that they grew 30% while non-cloud IT spending fell double digit. This has resulted in a remarkable flip. Next slide. Back in 2019, and it varies by industry, roughly 60% of all of the computational tasks in the enterprise were still done on-prem, on the premises. Just about 40% were done in the cloud. Even as late as 2019, cloud, only 40%. Fast forward to 2021, and by the end of this year, we predict that 65% will be done in the cloud and about 35% will be done on-prem. This has flipped the dynamic from cloud being a minority of all compute tasks to a majority. Lots and lots of implications there. Next slide, please. To quote Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, we've seen 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. Cloud data traffic up 100% year over year, according to people who measure that. Cloud ETFs up basically double the NASDAQ and 4 times higher than the S&P 500. Lots of money going around. Hyperscale CapEx about 150 billion. A couple points here. Cloud is more sustainable. When people have webinars instead of actually flying around the world for meetings, that saves the planet. When people work from home instead of driving in cars to home, that saves the planet. When people watch streaming video, yes, the data center for Netflix uses energy. It's about the same amount as having a 60-watt bulb run for about 12 minutes. It uses so much less energy than getting in your car and driving to a movie theater. You know what? The energy used by the popcorn machine probably is more power than the entire Netflix thing. So generally speaking, cloud is more sustainable than non-cloud alternatives. Okay, so I wanted to address that point. Next slide, please. Now, I want to have a bit of a chat on virtual reality. Next slide. You've seen maybe this kind of slide. This is actually from Deloitte, Denmark, so some of you may have actually seen this. Digital reality changes everything. Next slide. Lots of industry examples from North America, from Asia, from Europe, auto manufacturing, industrial machines, all kinds of stuff. Next slide, please. Walmart, Volkswagen, insurance companies. Next slide, please. It's a lot of it's about trading. Training is probably the single biggest market here. If it's too dangerous, too difficult, or too expensive to train in the real world, why wouldn't you train in a virtual one? Next slide. Now, here comes the weird bit. I'm real excited about VR and AR and MR used in the enterprise, in education for largely training, but other applications as well. But it's a tiny, tiny market. We're talking a couple 100,000 headsets per year in 2021. That's all. Why so small? Why isn't it bigger? Well, the first thing is that they tend to be shared devices. As a very real world example, Walmart, real story, trained a million employees using 17,000 devices. That's one per 60. You don't all need to use it at the same time. So it's much more like printers or projectors and much less like computers or smartphones. Not every worker needs a headset. Nordic example, this one was from no, not Nordic, sorry, Netherlands example. There was a VR pilot done, but only for new hires and subcontractors. Okay. Not every location needs headsets. So here in Canada, in our province of Saskatchewan, we had a VR medical program, and in the big cities, which in Saskatchewan aren't even all that big, they didn't get VR headsets because they didn't need them. In small cities, they didn't need them. Even in small towns, they didn't need them. It was only the most remote that needed them. And so, yeah, it's only 22 headsets for the entire province. The other thing is that the headsets themselves are only a part of the picture. They U.S. Army deal, $480, almost $500 million with Microsoft, and about 2,500 headsets by our estimate. Most of the money went for customization and R&D and content and special gear. So just a small percentage, maybe 1 in 6 of the dollars actually goes for that. Next slide, please. So wanted to talk, just step back for a second and talk about the consumer here. A lot of people, a lot of things saw tremendous growth in 2020 during the pandemic. You've seen the numbers from Netflix and other video streaming, just it was a forced experiment. Online commerce, ordering groceries by online, which I had never really done before and used massively. Work from home, learn from home, video visits. There were all these things, and people went out there and they tried them, and we saw enormous numbers. We did not see that for consumer VR. You would have thought this was the perfect time. People would buy VR headsets, and if you couldn't really go to France for summer vacation, maybe you could buy a VR headset and pretend to walk around the Louvre and look at the paintings. People did not do that. As Benedict Evans said, this should have been a consumer VR moment, and it wasn't, and just the market there is really quite disappointing. Even in the enterprise, it's big, but it's kind of niche. Education, it's interesting, it's growing, but it's still kind of small. But I want to put that all in context. These are multi-billion-dollar markets growing at double-digit, close to 100% rates. However, it's kind of like my phrase is always, it's like a scuba mask. If you want to go explore the Great Barrier Reef, you have to put on a scuba mask and swim around. But if you're sitting on the beach afterwards, you don't keep wearing the mask. If you are in your hotel room, you don't keep wearing the mask. If you go out to dinner, you don't wear the mask. The mask is a powerful, important, and special tool, but you only wear it during a specific task because you don't use it the rest of the time. And I think VR and AR and mixed reality headsets need to be thought about in that way. Next slide, please. So we're going to shift gears now and talk about TV sets. How exciting. Next slide. So what's the prediction? We're saying that sales of 8K TV sets, which have 4 times as many pixels as 4K, and 4K had 4 times as many as HD, which had 4 times basically as many as standard def. So the TVs keep getting better. We're predicting that sales of 8K TVs, which is the next thing to come after 4K, will be 1 million TV sets, reaching 3.3 billion this year. Now, that's a small part of the TV market. There's about 200 million TV sets sold per year, but this is a $3.3 billion market. I was at CES in Las Vegas earlier this year, virtually, and lots of talk about 8K TVs. Plus, there's lots of other gear that goes into the broadcast equipment chain. Now, there's 2 questions that are going to get asked here. The first question is, do I need an 8K TV set? And my answer to you is no. No, you don't. Probably not. I don't need one. You don't need one. Very few people need one. But you know what? We didn't really need 4K TV sets either, and we're buying them anyway. In 2021, around the world, more than half of all the TV sets sold will now be 4K. See, the thing is that people buy TV sets and keep them for 5, 10, 15 years. So to some extent, people buy whatever is the latest, greatest technology because they're future-proofing themselves. Next, it kind of feels good. You buy, no, don't move my slides yet, Lena. In a second. It feels good. People buy 4K or 8K because it's the latest and greatest and you can brag about it. But the third factor is probably the most important. It's what's for sale. If you walk into a TV set store and you want to buy a TV set with, this feature or that feature or HDR or that kind of screen and this sound system, maybe it only comes in 4K. Maybe it only comes in 8K. And so we believe there's sort of a creep where if you buy it's like you get a car and it's got this kind of, coffee cup holder. You may not even drink coffee, but you get the holder for free because you bought the entire car. In the same way, 8K is following along. So that's the first question. Nobody needs 8K, but we're going to buy it anyway over time. By 2030, everybody will have 8K TV sets. The next question, Lean, next slide, is what am I going to watch? There's nothing out there in 8K. No, there's some stuff, not much. What we are seeing, though, is that a lot of the 4K content can now be upscaled to 8K using AI chips on these TV sets. And that actually works remarkably well. Now, we've had upscaling before, and I probably shouldn't say this, it sucked. It was just terrible. All kinds of color distortion and jaggies and aliasing and stuff like that. But the new AI chips on these TV sets are amazingly powerful, and we are just seeing the upscaling. Go check it out. It looks pretty good. Next, the PS5 and the Xbox X both support. The PS5 and the Xbox X both support 8K. Plus, see my phone? I think my phone is 24 megapixel. It shoots 8K photos and 8K video. Home working at CES, a lot of people were talking about 8K home monitors. So these are giant monitors, and you can get really close and have like spreadsheets and stuff. Very cool. Lots of other applications. Next slide, please. So we're going to now shift gears and talk about 5G. Next slide, please, Lee. So you can see a slide. It actually has Denmark on this. Now, you might be sad and upset because it shows that Denmark is actually at the far right of this slide, and that's usually bad. Actually, what this shows is the percentage of people who, may I say so, falsely believe that 5G is a health risk. In Denmark, that's only 13%, which is actually among the lowest. So yay, Denmark, you're doing real well. But in some other countries like Austria, like Belgium, Belgium, what is that? 34%. More than 1 in 3 people in Belgium are afraid of 5G. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to talk to you again about my little. So here are the fears. 5G causes radiation sickness. 5G weakens the immune system, and 5G towers cause COVID, which is completely bonkers, and that never happened. So don't worry about that one. But I want to talk about my little phone here. You saw that speed test here. So this is a 5G phone. That is a 5G tower, and I am in Canada. Okay, everybody's with me so far. What I want to tell you is that the radio waves used here in Canada for me to get 313.5 megabits per second from that tower to my phone are at a frequency band of around 600 megahertz. And that frequency band is not a new band. Before Canada's cell phone company started sending me 5G signals, there was somebody else using that band. It was for TV. That was used for TV signals from a tower that's just that way, not that far, a couple kilometers away from me. Next slide, please. Now, the thing I want to tell you about is that tower that I can see 100 and some meters away from me is broadcasting in 5G some of the time to me at about 100 watts. It might be 50, it might be 100. It's not 200 because it's not that far away. So 50 to 100 watts. And that TV tower that was broadcasting before 5G broadcast at 100,000 watts. It's the same radio waves. 600 megahertz radio waves were traveling to me before 5G and are traveling to me now, but at 1,000th the amount of power. So those radio waves, if they didn't harm me before, if they didn't, they're 1,000 times less likely to harm me now. 5G uses less power than what went before. My phone, because the towers are so much closer in 5G than they used to be, my phone uses less power to broadcast, 90%, 95% less. In other words, 5G uses less energy than 4G. The base stations are able to go into sleep mode when they're not in use, which means that when they get pinged, they do so 20 times less often. They use less power than 4G did. Finally, well, I'll hold up my darn phone again. When I talk to my phone here, and I can see that tower, it sends radio waves to me here, but my neighbor next door doesn't see the same power radio wave. If Barbara, my wife, was upstairs, she wouldn't get the same power. It uses a technique called beamforming to make sure that the radio waves are concentrated in a narrow area. For all of these reasons, 5G is in fact safer than 4G was, and 4G wasn't dangerous at all. Next slide, please. Going to have a quick chat about women's sports. Next slide, please. It's bigger, maybe. Well, I don't know. Maybe you know this already, but I was surprised at some of these numbers. 84% of sports fans watch at least one women's sport. They're coming out in person in 2020. Australia had done a good job on controlling COVID. 86,000 fans congregated in person, live in a stadium. In football, Women's World Cup, this is last year, 2 years ago now, nearly 1 billion people watched the Women's World Cup on TV, 500 million online, and the final actually was watched more in the US. More people watched the women's final than had watched the men. So lots of interesting growth there. Next slide, please. So we're predicting it's going to grow. Why? A little bit of it is about the ROI. Next slide, please. Let's start off. I mean, you can look at the whole thing. It's all fine. But I want you to focus on the little basketball at the top left there. So I'm going to go a bit slowly and walk you through carefully on this one. In the US, ESPN just paid $25 million to broadcast the WNBA. If you've ever seen it, it's actually a really good game. They're just amazing athletes. So $25 million. Men's basketball, which is more popular, I'm not arguing it isn't, men's basketball costs $2.6 billion. That is 104 times more, okay? But more people watch men's basketball, sure. The 2020 finals for the women were, I forget the number, and the men's number was bigger, absolutely, 100%, absolutely. It was definitely bigger. It was 17 times larger. My point is, women's sports rights right now are very inexpensive, but draw interesting audiences that are growing and are demographically different than men. I think this is just, it's a real kind of, if I were in the sports rights business, women's sports look like a heck of a bargain. Next slide. I think this is our final topic. No, I've added some extra slides. Anyway, keep going. Next slide, please. So hyper-quantified athlete, what are we talking about here? It's more than just a stopwatch timing somebody running around a track or a radar gun control showing how fast a baseball is thrown, or tennis, I suppose. We are predicting that there will be enormous growth in this hyper quantification of sports. It's becoming increasingly real time, around the clock, inside and outside the body, all enabled by shift in technology with the cloud and machine learning and AI and video. And it's not even on here, but drones as well. Next slide. All kinds of stuff, positional data, biometric data. Next slide. What are you using this for? Things like scouting, talent identification. This kind of stuff is great at finding young athletes that maybe are poised to be breakthrough. It's used in in-game decision making. Is that player doing all of a sudden very well? Have they overcome their sore leg? Are they about to get a sore leg? That kind of in-game stuff. But probably the biggest factor for me is the injury reduction. The cost of injured athletes in any sport is enormous. One study showed that the NFL lost more than $500 million due to injuries. Plus, there are concerns out there about long-term effects like concussion. For those of you who watch football, Patrick Mahomes was concussed in a recent game. Imagine if you'd had even better detail about the force of his head hitting the turf and stuff like that. Next slide, please. So we think it's coming, it's growing, but there is a conversation to have between athletes, between sports leagues, player unions, TV broadcasters, all of it. Next slide. I think this is my final topic, the intelligent edge. Next slide. I'm going to talk about Denmark and I'm going to talk about Canada. Right now on this vMix call webinar-ish thing that we're doing, I bet there isn't a data center in Canada for this. I bet it's somewhere in the States. I'm sorry, small country. I just know the Americans have their own data center and we probably don't. Okay, it might even be in California. It might be literally 6,000 kilometers away from me. I bet there might not be a data center in Denmark. Maybe it's down in Hamburg or maybe even Paris or something like that. Could be further away. What's that, 1,000 kilometers or so? Something like that. When we look at computing, frequently the computing power sits thousands of kilometers away from us. Then there might be a network that's a little closer so that it's like, 500 kilometers away from us. And then there's one in the metro area that might be even a little bit closer that's, maybe it's only 100 kilometers away. Maybe not too far from where we are. But there are certain applications that require even closer processing power to the end user for reasons of latency, things like gaming and video and Internet of Things and intelligent automation and all that kind of stuff. So those are part of what we call the far edge network, and that is a really interesting market. Next slide, please. Lena, there we go. Great. So we're predicting that the intelligent edge market will expand to $12 billion, which is up 100% from where it was in 2019. So a very high rate of growth. In the early days, and I'll be blunt here, it's largely being driven by the telcos and the hyperscalers. Hyperscalers are Microsoft, Amazon, Google, IBM, Alibaba, a few others. So there's a battle. There's a battle right now. The telcos want to own the intelligent edge, and the hyperscalers want to own the intelligent edge. Sometimes they're fighting with each other and building competitive networks. Sometimes they're partnering with each other and building these networks. But that's really the story in 2021. Those two players. Over the longer term, the market expands into manufacturing, industrial, supply chain, ports, lots of it. Right now, no single player owns the intelligent edge. That will, over time, that could change, I suppose. But right now, it requires a lot of coordination between different players. Next slide, please. What does it do? It brings computation, data analytics, and AI right up to the edge. Why? To reduce latency. This is not new. It's been going on for decades. It does not, I got to wave them. It does not replace the cloud. This works hand in hand with the cloud together. There is stuff the cloud does real well, and there's stuff that the edge does real well, and you need the two of them at the same time. It is, at the end of the day, more responsive, flexible, and autonomous. Next slide, Lee. This is a real example from Asia Pac port. They installed connectivity, a mixture of Wi-Fi and I believe 5G with Edge AI to automate the cranes and the trucks. It works. It works great. Labor costs down by 70 and operational efficiency up by 30. Questions? I mean, like that one's real obvious. So this is exactly the kind of example, and there's dozens and dozens more that we could talk about. Next slide. Now, For those of you in the media space, I have a few bonus slides here that I just threw together, and I've been talking about these because they're real interesting to me. So the first thing I want to talk about is we focus a lot on SVOD, subscription video on demand services, things like Netflix and Disney Plus, where you give them your money and you get to watch the shows. Yay! Those are the blue circles on this chart. Okay, and I got to put my glasses on because I can't read all the data. So I was just doing a webinar in France yesterday, and the blue circles are SVOD, things like Netflix and Disney. The pink circles are AVOD, ad-supported video on demand. It's basically free. It's video. It's on demand, but you got to watch ads. Okay. And let's just take a look at France. So in France, number one is YouTube, no surprise. Number two is Netflix. That's not the pattern in a lot of countries. But I want to just point out that number three is France TV, MyTF1, Sisplay, Art TV. The what is that? Of the top six networks there, five of the six aren't SVOD, they're AVOD. So I really want. We had a prediction about AVOD last year, and it's huge. It's massive. So SVOD matters, subscription matters, but so does the ad market. The ad market hasn't gone away. Next slide, please. One of the things I want you to focus on right here that I see as particularly interesting in the AVOD market is the growth of YouTube. In 2017, YouTube, actually in 2018, they announced that in 2017, they had passed, for the first time than ever, more than 1 billion hours of YouTube was watched per day. Okay, so that was like 3 years ago. So I ran some numbers. This is me. And I was able to figure out that there's a surprising amount of YouTube being watched on TV sets. And by my estimate, I've got to put my glasses back on because I can't see my slides. By my estimate, what is it, about 450 million hours of YouTube is watched on TV sets globally per day. Now, most people watch more YouTube on their smartphones and computers and tablets and stuff like that. And that's another 870 million hours of YouTube per day. And that's from the OECD alone. When I add in my estimate for YouTube on non-TV devices in the rest of the world, that's another 400 million. All in, it's about 1.7 billion hours of YouTube being watched daily. So point one, that's a lot. Point two, it's growing about 50-60% per year. Point three, they're about to cross 2 billion. I predict that in 2021, we may see an announcement that YouTube has crossed 2 billion hours of TV a day. That's going to be about 50% more than all of the television watched in the United States every day. U.S. TV market's a $100 billion plus market. So I'm not saying YouTube's that big. I'm comparing apples and oranges, and I know that, and you know that, and everybody in the media business knows that. But it's interesting. That's a lot of time that people are spending in front of an ad-supported service like YouTube. Next slide. This is from a Deloitte report that was just published last week. And I think this is fascinating stuff. We're now talking about SVOD. So you knew I wouldn't avoid it entirely. And we're going to questions in just 1 minute. But I wanted to talk about this just before I move on. We did two surveys, each about 1,000 people, each in the United States. And in May 2020, 23% of people added an SVOD service, 9% added and canceled, and 5% canceled. Okay, fine. Fast forward 5 months. The percentage of people who added a streaming service went from 23% to 20%. I predict that this year, when we do the survey again, it'll be more like 17 or 16%. The percentage who just canceled video service went from 5 to 4. I don't think that's statistically meaningful. But what I find fascinating is the percentage who both added and canceled went from 9% to 34%. It grew nearly 5 times. Churn is the new normal. People don't sign up to a video service and just leave it there forever. People are adding and subtracting, they're binging and finishing and canceling, and then starting up again in 3 months or 6 months or 1 month or 3 days or 5 years or something. The question then becomes not just about customer acquisition costs, but we have to start having conversations about retention. How do you get them to churn less? Maybe you decide you can't get them to churn less, so you start thinking about, okay, how do I make it easy for them to pause their subscription Maybe I can continue a relationship. Maybe I can keep a billing number and start it up again automatically when this new show that they want to watch comes. You see how the conversation changes about churn? So I think this is just going to be one of the hottest topics for 2021 and 2022. On that note, Lena, next slide. As always, I put up my contact information. Here is Duncan. Please feel free to email me. I do virtual presentations all the time in Denmark and elsewhere. If you want me to do a customized presentation for your company, please reach out to me or to my colleagues at Deloitte Denmark. The other thing, though, is that a lot of the things I've been talking about, YouTube and SVOD and AVOD and other stuff like quantum computing and batteries and women in tech in the Nordics. I wrote an article about gender diversity in IT in the Nordic market, and I published that on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook. Please do connect with me. Happy to see you. Happy to accept your request. And I don't have a newsletter. Everybody's got a newsletter this day. I don't have time for a newsletter. But what I do have is I have my social media, and that's where I publish those articles. Lena, on that note, do we have any questions from the line? I think there's a chat button here. I'm not seeing anything yet. Oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of questions there and I haven't seen them. Sorry. Okay, because I was busy talking and picking up my phone and stuff like that. Video visits. Oh, host. Is video visits only for young people? Sorry. No, this is so cool. It's the exact, that would have been such a great question. So the question is, I'm going to read the full one. I'll slow down here. Are video visits only for young people? What about the older segment with limited knowledge about how smartphones video calls work? Will they stop going for the doctor if it's difficult for them to figure out how a video call works? Sorry, that was maybe a great question in 2015, maybe even 2018. It's not true anymore. Data we have from the United Kingdom shows that 97% of people over the age of 65 have either a computer, tablet, or smartphone with video capability. But they don't know how to use Zoom. Of course they do. During the lockdowns, I mean, my mother, who's 80, could in fact give a seminar on how to do Zoom calls and use the different backgrounds. So I actually believe that this older demographic are in fact some of the biggest users of video. It's how they've been in touch with their grandchildren. And now that they know how to do that, talking to a doctor isn't any harder. The reason this matters so much, and I don't have numbers for Denmark, but I do for the US, those over 65 are only 18% of the US population as of 2021, but they represent about 30% of medical visits. So video visits are actually not only for young people, they are for all demographics, and that's one of the reasons why it's going so well. I normally travel the world for my presentations. When thinking of cloud sustainability, will you continue your virtual journal or are you longing for a real journey? So great question. I would auction off several of my children to be able to start traveling again. So I'm definitely longing for it. It will be interesting to see, not so much what I want, because I love travel, and also I think that the impact of I mean, I do a lot of things to try to reduce my carbon footprint, so I'm okay with a bit of travel, going back to a bit of travel again. It will be interesting to see about conferences and stuff like that. I will tell you right now that just as an example, I haven't seen the numbers for this grab and go, but I did a Canadian webinar. So this was one normally in Canada across the various events I do. We get about 3,000 people attending. I did a video webinar, theoretically easier to go to, and we only got about 500 people registered. Now, 500 people, that's amazing for a webinar. That's huge. But it really isn't that good compared to the in-person numbers. I believe human beings, I mean, we will use this video stuff now because it's what we have. But I honestly believe that we have a very human desire to see each other in the flesh. Next question. Do I predict that the development in cloud data traffic will stand still after COVID? I predict it will continue. Remember that a lot of industries, things like travel, airlines, hotels, restaurants, a lot of businesses have really reduced their spending and use of the cloud because people aren't doing as much. We're in the middle of an economic slowdown. I predict in 2021, as the vaccine kicks in and we move into a post-pandemic world, I predict cloud traffic growth will maintain more or less its doubling year-over-year levels. Why do you think people in Belgium and Austria are more afraid of 5G than Denmark? We are pretty close to each other and quite alike. My belief is it's the amount of licorice you eat. I believe that eating a lot of licorice gives you a Okay, I'm kidding. I happen to know that people in Denmark like licorice. I don't actually know why that is. I suspect it may be cultural reasons. It may be political campaigns. I can't answer that. It's an interesting question, though. Not a question. You have a fact. The world's most expensive football player sold to Chelsea for 340,000 euros. Oh, cool. Send me her name. I'd like to look her up and I can make her a part of my slide deck. That sounds fun. Okay, and I have another question here at the bottom. What about esport? What's the outlook for 2021? So esports, we've talked about that before. It's funny. The growth in esports in 2020 was lower than I would have expected. I figured with so many people locked down and people not able to, many sports stopped playing. They're back now largely, but many sports stopped. I would have thought there'd be much bigger growth in esports. So it's growing. It's, I think, through $1 billion in 2020. And I think we're looking for about 1.2 to 1.3 billion this year. But still, gosh, $1 billion, that's not bad. But that's a third the size of the 8K TV market. That's the radio industry is 40 billion. Heck, the cinema industry down, I don't know how much percent this year, 50%. It's still a $20 billion industry. So just esports remains fascinating, amazing demographics. It's really cool, but still really quite niche when you take a look at it in terms of dollars. Now, if you look at it in terms of reach and time, there's a lot of people out there consuming and playing esports, but it's not showing yet up on the dollar side. That's great. Lena, do we have any more questions, or are we done? Thank you, Duncan. But lots of thank you for a great webinar. Well, I like that too. So on that note, I'm going to do one question that I didn't get, and then I'll wrap it up. But I promise this will be quick. One of the questions that I get almost every year when I'm in Denmark or anywhere is, hey, what's going on with AVs? What's happening with those autonomous cars, those self-driving cars, the robot cars? Is that this year? Is that next year? AVs are not the technology of the 2020s. It turns out, according to almost everybody looking at this, that actually coming up with a truly driverless cars that works in cities and bad weather and fog and rain and snow and can drive around Copenhagen without hitting people on bicycles is really, really, really hard. It will not happen in 2021. It won't even happen by 2025. The people out there are saying 2030s. Instead, the 2020s are the decade of the EV, electric vehicles. Now, still fairly small, about 4 million last year worldwide out of a couple 100 million car sales. So still small percentage-wise, but the ramp this year to next year to by 2025, there's some people out there saying we could be seeing 30, 40, 50 million electric vehicles, fully electric, battery electric vehicles per year. So keep an eye on the EV. Now, I need to make a point. There's a lot of cars out there. The existing fleet, the installed base is massive, and people keep cars for 10, 15 years. So it's going to take a while to get rid of all those internal combustion engine cars and replace them with EVs. But your takeaway here is the 2020s are the decade of the AV, and the 2030s, of the EV, and the 2030s are the decade of autonomous vehicles. So think about it in your brain that way, and I think that'll help a lot. On behalf of the entire team at Deloitte Denmark, I'd like to thank you for joining us for this grab and go. I am sorry you are not getting a little paper bag filled with sandwiches the way you normally do at Deloitte's office in Copenhagen. I'm sure you miss that. I miss that too. I really hope that I'll be able to see you next year in person. And I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank Frederick, my colleague in Denmark, and Lena for doing such a great job organizing this Grab and Go webinar. So thanks, everybody, and have a great Thursday.